All right, thank you everybody for joining here in the classroom and on Zoom. I'll be watching the waiting room. I know we have a few folks still coming in late. I want to thank our three guests today for joining us for this session about editing and publishing. I think especially for history majors here, because history majors obviously are the best. But also, no, I'm just kidding, in case any of our guests are not history majors, that's a joke. But for really any of the fields that we're going to discuss today, and I know that we may have guests coming in from other departments that are also the best, and we're excited about sort of speaking across disciplines. I know I've worked with Don before. And in a very interdisciplinary sort of a context, which I think was a lot of fun, sort of bridging anthropology and history. So without further ado, I want to introduce our three guests. I want to thank Don for joining, Don Rosso from Waveland Press. And I also want to thank Don for introducing our two other guests, Lily Capstick, who's joining us as an editor from Siren Story House, and also Jess, who's joining us from the Motley Fool and is also a freelance editor, as is Lily Capstick, I believe, we'll learn more about both of them and about Don's work as soon as I turn the floor over to them. So please join me in giving a virtual welcome to our guests. Thank you so much for joining. I realize now I didn't establish an order, which is probably the one thing I should have done. So if anybody wants to jump in, please feel free, hop in with some introductions and hellos and a couple words for our students, and then we'll move into discussion.
Don, I think you should start.
I thought since you were unmuted, you would be the obvious choice, but hi everybody, I'm Don. Thank you, Jeremy, for having us here. So I wear a lot of hats at Waveland Press. We are a publisher of textbooks for college classes, including Jeremy's book on Asian cultural traditions that he mentioned, which is anthropology history crossover covering the whole Asian continent. We are a small company, about 15 office staff plus our warehouse staff. As a result, we all have to wear a lot of hats. My primary two roles are in acquisitions editing, which we can probably talk about a little bit more in depth later. Basically, managing some of our catalogs, deciding which books to publish, which books we should go after and try to publish more of, that sort of thing. I also handle all of our production duties. That involves interacting with the manufacturers to turn our PDFs of the pages that we create into real finished books. But as I said, we're a small operation, lots of hats, so I've pretty much worked in every facet of the business as can be. So that's the short version. I will hand it over to Jess.
Thanks, Don. As Jeremy said, I work currently as a financial editor at the Motley Fool, and I moonlight as a freelance editor. I started my career in academic publishing as an acquisitions editor many years ago, and that's kind of where I met Don. You know, all the editors kind of try to stick together at conferences. So we met at an academic conference when I was a history and anthropology editor, primarily acquiring from academics in those fields. So that's kind of how I started my freelance career on the side, working with those fields. So I mostly work on monographs and textbooks in those fields. And then by day, I'm more of a news editor than a book editor. So at the Motley Fool, most of what I'm working on is financials and markets news. And that is obviously something that is a little bit different from academia, but it's still very sort of, rigorously fact-checked, scholarly, nonfiction. So yeah, if it's fiction, I don't want to touch it. How about you, Lily?
Awesome. My name's Lily. So happy to be here. So I'm a freelance editor and writer. And so I started out working with the local TEDx Mile High in Denver. working as a writer. And through that, realized that I actually preferred editing people's writing than writing it. And I actually worked with Jess, or I was put in touch with Jess, who then put me in touch with Dawn, and then I was able to work with Waveland Press, and that's where I've done a lot of my book editing, but I also do editing for other publishing houses, nonprofit organizations, small businesses, and independent authors. I actually do enjoy editing fiction, so that's something that I'm building out right now. But yeah, so my business, Syrian Story House, it's just me, but that is my freelance kind of business, and that's where I do all of my editing. I'd say that my specialization right now is academic nonfiction, and so that's where that'll be very relevant for all of you. But I do enjoy all types of writing, and I've done a lot of editing on articles and other forms. And I also worked for the Motley Fool with Jess for a bit as well. So I love editing. I'm happy to be here, and yeah, it's me.
Thank you all for that quick introduction. Lucas already jumped in with a question for Lily. What sort of fiction do you prefer to edit?
Well, so I would say, honestly, at this time, any fiction I'm very happy to edit. I actually did edit with Waveland Press a book of short plays, which was very fun. I really enjoyed that. And then also something I was going to mention to all of you is that if you are interested in going into freelance novel editing, because you have this history knowledge, you could specialize in like the historical area that you specialize in for novelists who are doing historical nonfiction. I don't have that expertise, but I think if I did, I would probably do that because I think historical nonfiction is really fun and interesting. Yeah, that's my answer.
Great, thanks. And thanks for jumping right in, Lucas. I want to urge everybody else to please jump in with any questions. There are a couple of themes that have emerged, and we've done 5 of these sessions now, talking with museum workers, teachers at the 7 to 12 level, community college teachers, also California State Park interpreters, which is another field for history majors. So this one I think this one fits in terms of thinking about the professional transition from graduating, obviously, to entering the job market. And one of the themes that emerges is what do I wish I'd known when I was finishing up my undergrad career in terms of positioning myself for an ideal leap into this world. And we're talking about multiple worlds now, right? We're talking about working as a salaried employee for a publisher or doing freelance work. But in any of these modes, if there's anything that sort of jumps to mind in terms of lessons learned over the last few years since graduating, that's sort of one thing. And then later I want to talk about if any of you have been, and Don, this may apply to you, but also others, in terms of hiring or thinking about the sort of ideal job candidate. How do you sort of reverse engineer that in terms of planning as a student at the bachelor's level? And I know I've got some BA students here and also some MA in history students. So are there anything that is there anything that jumps to mind when I say, what do you wish you had known when you were finishing up your career? Jess, please jump in.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think probably the biggest hint I have there is to read broadly and know what your competition is, but also what the conversation is. I feel, especially with history, it's a very document heavy field and it's a very collaborative field. So, you're graduating into this field that already exists. So you're not sort of reinventing the wheel. There's stuff out there already. So, in your undergrad and your grad work, you're going to learn those fundamentals. You're going to read the books in your specialization, but read outside of that and really just take the time to see what's being published, what people are writing. If you can even read, unpublished theses sorry, I'm blanking on the word, but if you can read the unpublished work of other academics and read what's coming out in the field, that's really what's going to teach you how to sort of seamlessly step into the dance that is, the published work of historians.
Yeah, and building on what Jess just said, yeah, read. And when you read, don't just skim through stuff to get the idea. Read the words, read how things are put together. Take your time reading, and the more you do that, the more you get a better feel for language, you get a better feel, not just for the ideas, which are very important, of course, at every level, no matter what you're doing, but also how something reads, the clarity, how am I conveying this idea? Because if you do get involved in editorial specifically, that's a lot of what you're doing. You're not really, you want to make sure that if you're rewriting something, you're not changing what the author is saying, you're just making them say it better. And the best way to learn that skill is to just read your own writing and that of others, and as Jess said, read as broadly as you can. There's benefits to reading academic journals, there's benefits to reading trade books, there's benefits to reading Shakespeare, even if you're going into nonfiction writing. You just get a better feel for words and how that works. Something else that I want to bring up is that book publishing specifically, and of course I can only really speak to nonfiction book publishing, draws a huge range of backgrounds. Some fields you go into, you have to have a particular degree, you have to have a particular set of coursework involved. Publishing isn't like that. A lot of people that are in it have degrees in English or journalism, or both in Jess's case. But my background, I was a psychology major as an undergraduate. I went to graduate school in linguistics, was working on a PhD when I sort of fell into this career. But the big thing is I'm able to read critically. I'm able to think about different ideas, see how stuff goes together, and those skills are invaluable. And all that stuff comes not so much from a particular curriculum, but simply reading and writing a lot and, opening your mind to all that stuff.
I would also just add, wow, I think I just forgot. Never mind. Sorry. Also, I wanted to say that I'm sick. And so if I have to turn off my video to sneeze, that's what I'm doing.
Poor baby.
Thanks, Lily. Sorry to hear that. But I'm sure the idea will jump back. So please interrupt if it jumps back in. This is really helpful. And I think reading widely is another common theme that's emerging in our series of events that is being prepared to do what they call on job advertisements, other duties as advertised. That's the sort of catch-all that you often hear, and that is being ready to take on different roles, but having some working familiarity with a very, very wide number of different types of literature or even disciplines, right? As you're noting there, I think that's a really important point. And Jess, were you going to jump in response to Matt's question?
I was, yes. If you guys can't see the chat, the question is: I am currently editing our department journal. What advice can you give to make it sound better without changing the author's voice? And this is actually one of my favorite editorial tricks, which is to read it out loud. I very, very often, especially when I'm, knee deep in just like very complex, dense academic writing or, financial writing, if I read it out loud and it doesn't make sense or it sounds rambly in some way, sometimes, your ear hears what your eyes don't see. So read it out loud. and often that'll give you a place where you can, find where to break up the sentence or find where you can remove clunky language. And then as far as, without changing the author's voice, a lot of authors, it's important to have a working relationship with them. So, if you do change something significantly and you're worried like, ooh, is this really affecting the tone? Is this affecting their style? Call it out to the writer, like leave a little query or comment on the side that says, hey, this was clunky, so I reworded it. Did I change your meaning? Did I really change your tone? Let's work on this together and just have that collaborative relationship. I really don't appreciate the kind of adversarial stereotype of editor versus writer. My job is a lot easier when I'm, close with my writers and we have a good level of communication. So yeah, that's my 2 pieces of advice for that is read it out loud to fix what sounds weird and have a good working relationship with your writers.
That's excellent. And I like that sort of blowing up that myth of the sort of necessarily adversarial relationship. We also have that as instructors, the sort of idea that the red pen is always somehow a fatal judgment on the sort of failings of the writer, when of course we're all kind of working together to do the best thing we can possibly do. It does obviously get adversarial sometimes. And sorry, Lily, you're going to jump in here.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to say that I remembered what I was going to say.
Go. Yeah.
So it's kind of similar to myth busting. I think that something I wish I had known when I was first starting out is just that there are so many careers that you can use your skills in reading and writing. I think that so many people say like, oh, you're majoring in English, like what are you gonna, what kind of job can you possibly have? You'll never make any money. And it's just ridiculous because everything needs words. Words are used in everything, in every business. And nobody tells you that you can work for yourself too, because people will say like, oh, it's so hard to get a job for a publisher and they don't pay anything. But there's this whole world of people who work for themselves. And I think it was just something that nobody ever talked about. So I think a panel like this is really great because we get to tell you these things that people didn't tell us, which is that if you are interested in this, you should definitely go for it. There's so many jobs and it's a really rewarding and wonderful career. So.
Thanks, Lily. And I do like the idea of maybe if we have time talking a little bit about the freelance world, because I know Lucas and some others are interested in this this type of work, what that looks like. I have some family members who are in that world, and we're in that world for a little while, freelance editing, and so I know a little bit about sort of their experience and the challenges, and so if there are any of the mechanics and the aspects of that you'd like to discuss, we can do that. But Fred, you had a question.
Okay, first of all, I'm not a student here. I'm Pam's husband. I am an archaeologist going on 77. I'm a published author, 17 journal articles, and one co-author on a book article. I'm curious about open access. Are you folks caught up in this whole open access business where the journals require that the authors pay to have their articles published, or is that only in the sciences? It's certainly in archaeology.
I started out my career in archaeology book publishing, but I left that field a couple of years ago. So I'm not aware of the open access situation. It seems, well, I won't speak to it. Dawn?
No, I actually can't speak to it. We're a commercial press, so everything that we publish is designed to be sold. As such, we have not engaged at all in the open access market. I think it's predominantly in the scholarly sector rather than the education sector, which is really what we specialize in.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, that's good. That's an important distinction, right? And often I think speaking as just in different fields, there's the perception of well, in history, the expectation is simply to publish a monograph, publish a book. And there are other fields like archaeology where the sort of markers are to publish articles, And there's a lot of, well, there's actually a lack of communication between the different fields about what the standard is for the academic path, where you need to be published and promoted in a certain way. And there's this idea among some disciplines that publishing a book is going to pay for your summer house. And that is not going to happen.
I didn't mean to laugh. I apologize.
No. I think we are here in the social and behavioral sciences, which is a little unusual for history. We're often in the humanities. In this school, we're in the social behavioral. So our neighbors, when they publish a criminal justice book, it's often a textbook, and it does pay for the summer house. And it doesn't necessarily advance the field. It's a nice contribution, but it's for the education field as opposed to the scholarly research and academics. So that I think there's a lack of sometimes communication across the disciplines in terms of what the standard is and what gets published. But
well, I would actually like to say that we do publish heavily in criminal justice. We actually have a number of authors who are in the department at CSUSB. And I will tell you, the books they write for us do not pay for the summer house.
They don't pay for so okay. I don't want to give.
So don't let them tell you otherwise.
But well, I mean, there are some textbooks certainly that move, and it depends, you know, what press it is, and it depends how they get assigned and you know how the work.
But one thing that I do want to say on that front, as long as we're talking about myth busting, is that is actually, those do exist, but they are a very, very small percentage of the textbooks that are out there. You know, the market can only hold so many introduction to criminal justice, introduction to cultural anthropology. You know, there's a few really, really big names that have very large budgets behind them, but that is certainly not the majority of what's out there.
That's sobering and important to also to hear. I think for a lot of people coming through academic publishing, and it's a nice push for editing, getting into the editing world, because the authors are for the most part going to be otherwise employed. They're going to be, you know, teaching to pay the bills, or affiliated with an institution, or maybe a research institution, but probably you know, a 2-year or 4-year college university. I've got a good question from Gustavo. This is particularly about Southern California, and he just sent it to me, but I'm going to just read it out here. Where are some good starting job positions if you want to pursue an editing career in Southern California? And this may be interesting to talk about geography and disembodied connections, and how you have explored that world, either needing or not needing to be physically in a certain place. So if anybody wants to jump in on that, Jess.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So, you know, particularly if you want to be an editor in academia, I'll tell you how I got my first job as an academic editor, which is I knew the region I wanted to live in, and that was Colorado. So I reached out to every academic publisher, university press, and journal in that region and said, hey, I'm a young aspiring editor. I'm very accomplished and talented. You should hire me. Here's why I want to work for you. Let me know if a position opens up. And obviously, you know, this was back in the day when letters were actually well received, but you can make this via email. So I would say, you know, if that's the field you're interested in, get in touch with publishers in your region. And to find those publishers, you should go to a website called Literary Marketplace. It also has a published directory that you can find at your university library. So it's LMP, Literary Marketplace. Jeremy, I don't know if you want to add that to the notes, but it is basically a list of every publisher and literary agent in the world, or at least the United States. And you can break it down by subject and region. And I definitely recommend starting there just to find the names of these places. And again, you know, you're part of the CSU system. So, you know, look at what journals are coming out of that system, look at your local university press, and see what they've got going on. But I would definitely start there. At the very least, ask them for informational interviews. But that's how I got my first job at the University Press of Colorado. And that's where I was editing, anthropology, history, archaeology. It's a small press, so I had to wear a lot of hats, this seems to be kind of a theme based on what Dawn does as well. Hope that helps.
And to follow up on that, Literary Marketplace is also how I got my start in the career, or my career start, which was before Jess's, we won't say how many years. I actually had to use the print version because there was no electronic version at the time, but it was a huge resource. As Jess said, it's got every publisher, it's organized geographically. A big part for me, as Jess was talking about wanting to live in Colorado, I live in Chicago. At the time I was working on my PhD, I was at the University of Chicago. I really couldn't relocate. And so Literary Marketplace being organized that way, I was really able to look at all the publishers that were in the Chicago area, all in one place. It was really a godsend. And also to speak to the other part of Gustavo's question, which is, what are some good starting job positions? This is something that's related to what Lily had said earlier, where she had mentioned there, you don't really talk about all the different possibilities. If, like, let's say you have a skill set in editing, and there's really, if you want to go into editing, there are all these myriad jobs. Well, that's looking at it a little bit more horizontally. Now, taking that question and flipping it vertically. Okay, I want to get a job, quote, in publishing or in book publishing. Now, looking at that a little bit more vertically and saying, okay, what jobs are available? What different skill sets can you then apply to that? A lot of people just think, when they think publishing, they think editorial. And that is a huge part of what we do. But it's also important to think about, you have marketing departments, you have production departments, you have design and composition departments. All of these people are working with books. And if you really want to be around books and you want to be around the written word, sometimes it's important to look at other areas of the whole publishing process that you might not otherwise have. It's not all about copy editing.
Agreed. I often tell people that the coolest people in publishing are the production staff. They are the designers, the typesetters, the people who are running logistics on how a book actually goes from a file to an actual printed book or ebook, or audiobook in some cases. So, if you are at all creative, book marketing and publicity is a huge thing. Like I said, design and production. If you like the financial side of things, there's room for more than just editors in the publishing world.
Yeah, and one of my first jobs was a fact checker for 5280 magazine, and that really taught me how to be extremely precise. I had to call every fact that they were going to print. I had to call everybody up and make sure that it was true. So that's the job. I also would say any writing job, I really started with writing, and I think it makes me a really good editor because I just was working on my writing skills for so long. So that could be, I was a writing intern for TEDx Mile High, and then I became a writer for them, and then I became an editor. So any writing jobs can lead into editing positions as well. And that's like journalism too.
Yeah, agreed. A lot of my writers at The Motley Fool have backgrounds in academia or backgrounds in grant writing and professional communications. And they just happen to have an interest in money, or their CPAs or whatever. For those who don't know, The Motley Fool is a financial services firm. We mostly write about investing. But like Lily said, writing jobs are everywhere if you look for them. Dawn, you want to take the next question?
Sure. So the question is from Daniela, and it's, how do you determine if a book or article is going to be of high quality or simply a disaster? And one thing that I want to speak to on this is you have to look at that from two different angles. One thing is the obvious answer, which is you read it, you know, quote unquote, can this person write? And you can tell pretty quickly, even early in your career, if you read just a paragraph or two, and do I understand what this person is trying to convey? It's that simple. Do I understand the idea that they're coming at? If it's disorganized, if it's disjointed, okay, there's this sentence and there's this sentence, how is that connected? That stuff comes out very quickly. But the other thing that's worth mentioning, and this is in this whole context of the diversity of publishing, which seems to be a theme here, is that when you're reading a particular book or a particular article, you're reading a sample of this writing. It should always be read in the context of who's the audience. So for example, when I'm reviewing writing samples, we publish books for undergraduate classes. Most of our authors are academics, they're PhDs. Their bread and butter, as Jeremy was mentioning, is writing articles, publishing for their peers, writing for other academics who really eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. What I'm reading for is, can an undergraduate student who's taking their first course in this subject understand what's going on? And that's not the same thing. You're talking about somebody that doesn't have that huge background that these academics have. And so it's important to think about that. Who is this being written for? And that there are different answers depending on what the end product is.
I'll also say, and this kind of leads into Jean's next question, that, you know, again, you need to read within the subject, you need to read broadly. So a lot of times when I was an acquisitions editor, I would acquire books, I would reach out to writers who, you know, contributed to an article or contributed a chapter to an edited volume where, you know, when they were maybe a younger academic just starting their career, and I'd be like, hey, I saw a lot of promise in that person's ideas and in their writing. And that way I can sort of self-select instead of waiting for somebody to come to me and say, hey, I have an idea for a book or an article. I could immediately be like, you look like you know what you're talking about and you can write, I'd like to work with you. But this kind of leads into Jean's question, which I don't know if you guys can see, but it's with the discussions that have been taking place in the country, i.e. history, do you find publishing is being influenced by the interests or expressed demands of readers? And I would say yes, in a good way. So for example, when I was a history editor, one of my lists, obviously at University Press of Colorado, like, you know, you think Colorado, you think the Wild Wild West when you think history, right? So we had a long backlist of cowboys and Indians books that were very much, you know, the young guns and the tombstone style history where it was a narrow view of sort of manifest destiny, what happens when white people come into the region. And I hear some giggles, and that is the correct response. But what I was seeing at that time was there was a heightened demand in both popular literature and academia, as you know, these new fresh voices got into history, of people being like, well, what's the Latino culture history in that area? Like what is the more modern Native American history in that region, you know, maybe early 20th century? Let's broaden our scope beyond sort of the traditional sense of regional history that you think of in Colorado to something that, you know, resonates more with these younger voices, with the more diverse population that's represented in the area. And I was really proud to work on those books. I really thought it was refreshing to say, okay, we've got these kind of tired ideas. This discussion has happened. What's the next discussion we can do? And I think that that's really exciting in history publishing in particular, but publishing in general, to just sort of tap into the zeitgeist, see what people are talking about and how your work can engage with it.
I also would add, just back to the quality of a book and whether or not it's going to be a disaster from a freelance perspective, is that most likely as a freelance editor, you're going to come into contact with people, especially if you're working with independent authors who are trying to publish books that, from your professional opinion, are really bad. And you have to decide if you want to proceed or not. there's always a way to improve the book, even if it's really a mess. Honestly, it can lead to more work for you. You can say, let's take a step back, let's do a developmental edit, which is a big picture edit, try to help restructure, and then after that, you can help them more with the nitty-gritty writing. You could even recommend, maybe you should hire a ghostwriter. I could help you like rewrite this. But also I know freelance editors that just don't want to work with for writers. And I completely understand that, because it can make it really hard. And it can be very frustrating when you're looking at a sentence that doesn't make any sense. It's also nice to, have on your list of books that you've edited really great books. So there's kind of, you can go one way or the other with that.
We have a question from Rosandra about when securing a job opportunity, does who you know matter more than your resume, or is it a mix of both? Considering both Lily and I have worked for and with Dawn, and Lily has worked for and with me. I mean, I won't say who you know doesn't matter, but I will say that, editors are very good at networking with each other, and we tend to want to work with people who we know are nice to work with. So I would say that's more about, just networking and getting your foot in the door. If you are a student of history, like, go to the conferences. There's always a book room. Talk to the editors who are in that room. We have to be there all day, standing in high heels for 10 hours. I mean, Dawn is really great at that, especially. But we want to talk to you. We want to answer your questions. We want to have these one-on-one conversations. And from my point of view, like, I found a lot of my favorite authors to work with that way, because I was constantly being like, oh, well, I remember 4 years ago we talked at a conference. It's so great that you're ready to turn your work into a book. Or, talking to maybe a junior editor at another publishing house, I got to know them, I got to know their work. And when they're ready to move on to another position, I would be like, oh, okay, well, we've got an opening and I know that you've already got a high quality of work. So again, attend academic conferences, do these networking events, and talk to the editors. Don't be afraid. We're desperate for attention.
Yes, I'd like to echo that. I was reflecting on how I've gotten my work in the past few years, and it was all through networking. Like, literally every piece of work that I've gotten. I obviously met Jess and then was put in touch with Dawn. Another example I like to give, because it's funny, but also because it shows how willing people are to help, is that my dad's long lost brother's son's ex-girlfriend was willing to meet with me, and I worked with her for 3 years, and she put me in touch with like 10 clients. So really just think, if you're, I think that's a good example, because if you're sitting there thinking like, I don't have a network, I don't have anyone, there might be some long lost siblings, or just, talk to everyone who is interested or works in what you're interested in, because especially freelance people love to help other freelancers, but I think also just editors in general, because you're just excited that someone likes what you like.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the reason that most of us do this is because we love writing, we love language, we love books, we love reading. And so, yeah, there is a sense of, it's not a secret society, but there's definitely a brother and sisterhood that runs throughout our industry. Take advantage of that. What Jess was saying about conferences is a fantastic idea, because you've got a lot of people in one place. If you've got cards, you can hand them out. It's great to have something physical that you can give to somebody. Every time I'm at a conference, I don't even think about the cards. I grab them. I sort them when I get back to my office. Get yourself out there. Never be afraid to talk to somebody. Never feel like you're wasting somebody's time before you start talking to them, because you don't know what kind of a connection that's going to turn into. There are so many opportunities out there of, a great resource is the Denver Publishing Institute. They are fantastic at networking their alumni. They've got lots of resources out there. But that's just an example of some of the organizations that are there. So networking is key, and make sure that you have an efficient network. Make sure that you've got a network that is interested in the things that you are, because it is such a wide world out there.
Yeah, and I'm a graduate of the Denver Publishing Institute, and I definitely think that I still keep in touch with my classmates and instructors, and it was a fantastic, not only educational opportunity, but great networking opportunity as well.
We've got a few, thank you, this is great. I don't want to slow anything down because we have some more questions, and I know Don, Lily, Jess, you can all see the question tab, the chat, so please feel free to scoop out any questions you'd like to address there. Just while you're taking a look there, I want to emphasize to our MA cohort that this is a network. You're in a network right now. Our MA students, things are going to be moving. We have a new MA program here. We've got the second cohort moving to graduation right now. Then the third cohort is in their first year. So this is a network. And I also want to note that in terms of going on to PhD programs, finding work, teaching, editing, and all different things, this is the beginning of a network. And as Jess and Lily and Don are saying, there are ways of extending that network and that awareness out more broadly. I'm just sort of vamping here while our guests take a look at the questions and decide. Jess, please jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to address the question from Daniela. If someone is looking to publish their work, what are some things they should be looking for in an editor or company? And I love that she's framing the question as like, what should we be looking for in an editor or publishing house? Because it's not just like, how do I find somebody who will work with me? Like, yes, value your work. You are smart, experienced academic writers, and you should be proud of your work, and you should be looking for a publishing house and an editor who believes in you just as hard and who is going to be respectful of your work and your time. I would often tell writers when I was writing their contract, I was like, this is a marriage contract. Like, if this is a book length publication, we're going to be working together for years. So we better like each other, and we better, get along well. So I would say, a publishing house that respects your time and your vision for your book. At the end of the day, your work is yours. The publishing house and the editor, they are just a vehicle to bring that to light. So be protective of your work. At the same time, make sure you're working with professionals and you're respecting their time and their expertise as well. My least favorite thing was when a writer would say, well, I want to have, the right of I want final say on the cover or whatever. And I'd be like, the designer, our in-house designer, is an award-winning professional, and I have never seen him create anything less than gorgeous. And he worked very closely with writers to make sure that he was representing their work accurately. So again, respect yourselves, respect other professionals, but also get that tea. So talk to other published writers and ask them what their experience was like with their publisher. Ask them what, look through journals that you might want to submit to and be like, oh, what was it like working with this journal's editorial staff? I guarantee you these writers are going to get back to you and just to say like whether or not they enjoyed their experience. So again, it's more networking. Don't be afraid to reach out to people. It really is, a rising tide lifts all boats. We're all in this together. So we really want to make sure that writers are getting matched with the right publisher.
Can I jump in with a quick question? I've got some friends, family members who have worked with book packagers connected to a few different organizations. They did. My brother did some work with DK books, getting books from concept to publication. Ended up doing a lot of the writing on young adult reference books and that kind of thing. Do any of you have any experience with book packagers? All right.
I don't know the term. It could be that, we've worked like that in some capacity. Different companies can use terminology a little bit differently.
Okay. Lily, we're going to.
Thinking you might be referring to a hybrid publisher, perhaps, where the person works with the publisher but pays money because it's kind of like it's kind of like they package everything, so like from the idea up until publication. Is that kind of what it is?
It might be. My brother was an independent contractor, and I know a couple others who have done, or an independent, a freelance editor, and he was doing some. I'm trying to remember the name of the organization. Anyway, I'll see if I can track it down. But I think one was called Media Projects, and basically it was a sort of multimedia platform, and they would work with very large publishing houses like DK, and they would have these reference guides for young adults, and basically it was a kind of narrow encyclopedia on these works. And so they would bring in a sort of team of authors, they would put it together, they would have some consultants at the local university who would sort of go through the materials. Anyway, sidetrack, and I will find out a little bit more about whether this is a common thing, or whether that maybe this is a team of authors and editors who bring work together to a publisher like DK or something like that. But let me I'll ask my guests to return to our excellent questions from our students, better ones than mine.
I wanted to respond to Gustavo's, which is how long should one spend editing and revising a manuscript? It's a good question, and the reason I like the question so much is the idea of an author editing before submitting is huge. We do, once when the book hits our offices, there's definitely an editorial process that happens, but editing your own work before you get to that point, editing it before somebody else is going to read it. And this applies to published work, it applies to the work that you guys are doing academically. Am I on the fritz for everybody, or is that just me?
Yes.
Okay.
Audio is good. Your audio, your video is doing some interesting stuff.
Yeah, it was.
We can hear you.
But we can hear you fine.
Okay, so when somebody else is going to read your work, whether it's a dissertation committee or an outside editor or an acquisitions editor for publication, it's really important for you to read it first, and read it twice. Make sure that you're reading it not just in the chunks as you're writing it, but you're reading it as an entire manuscript. Reading it, as your dissertation, read an entire chapter at a time. As far as how long that should be and how many times it takes, that's going to vary a ton depending on what you're writing. But I wanted to address that simply as the concept of editing your work before it moves on to the next stage. I can't emphasize how important it is enough. It's really crucial to criticize your own work before somebody else does.
Yeah, I would echo that, because to get the best benefit out of your editor, you should give them the best piece of writing you possibly can, because otherwise they're going to spend their time fixing things that you actually could have done if you had put in a couple more hours. And so you want to really you want to give them a piece of writing that you think is ready, and then the editor, you realize, finds all this stuff that is wrong with it, or ways to improve it, and then you get that benefit. So I think that's super important to remember.
Yeah. Mason actually has a similar question, which is about tips on how to streamline the writing process, because it takes him 10 minutes to write a small paragraph and he wants to make it as efficient as possible. I think that something that we kind of ignore in the writing and editorial fields is that people have different strengths and different abilities, and it has nothing to do with intelligence or quality of ideas. It's just our brains are wired differently. So again, I would go back to, if it takes you 10 minutes to come up with a small paragraph, find a different way of writing, whether it's dictating or just putting things in bullet points and then figuring out the connective tissues for those bullets later. Play around with stuff, but you don't need to sit down like the virtuoso at his piano and just start composing this beautiful symphony. you can come any way you want into the finished product of a completed manuscript. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter. Just figure out what works for you and try experimenting.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think one of the ways that I first started to love editing was when I embraced, and pardon my language, but the shitty first draft, which is where you just
And Lamont. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you just write really badly, like just write the whole thing extremely badly. And then you notice the art of editing when you go back and suddenly you're inspired by a sentence that then leads you to write a little bit more, and then you edit it and then it's better. And I think part of it can be writer's block, or just that need to like have a perfect paragraph, and that's what ends up taking 10 minutes. Is just that you're reading it over, you're writing, you know, you're okay, that doesn't make sense, you're overthinking it. So that can look like just sitting at your desk, you know, just setting a timer for 15 minutes and saying, I'm not allowed to delete anything, I'm not allowed to edit, I just have to write it. And I recently did, I don't know if anyone's familiar with NaNoWriMo, but it's a novel writing organization that it inspires people to write a novel. You're supposed to write 50,000 words in 30 days, and it seems just totally impossible, but you just have to write 1,667 words a day. They don't have to be good, and you just have to write it, and then at the end you have a first draft of a novel. It's not ready at all, but you have that draft, and that really helped me overcome a lot of my writer's block, and also just that like perfectionism that can happen when you're trying to write.
It's really, I share that that chapter from Bird by Bird with my students when we have a writing seminar. I think it's terrific. It's such great advice. And speaking of myth busting, as if somebody, they say Mozart used to sit down and write the whole score line by line from the beginning of the symphony to the end. He'd write the first violins, then the second violins, then the violas, then the cello, because he knew the whole thing. As if there's somebody who sits down and writes a piece that looks anything like what ends up getting published. And that is, you know, besides Mozart, the rest of us write shitty first drafts.
Yeah, he's the exception, not the rule.
Yeah.
I wanted to recommend another book on writing. Sorry, I'm reaching into my bookshelf over here, but it's Eats, Shoots, and Leaves by Lynn Truss. And it's another just lovely, lovely book on, you know, an approach to writing, how to write well, how to, you know, handle the editing process. And it's fucking funny, which I think is kind of necessary in any instruction guide.
Another book that it's going to sound odd to recommend it, but trust me on this one. Stephen King, of all people, who is widely acknowledged as, you know, oh, it's what he writes is trash. It's, you know, it's not great writing, blah, blah, blah. He has a book called simply On Writing that cannot be recommended highly enough. And if you get your hands on it, it doesn't matter what you're writing, you will learn from it. It's just a great treatise on the mental process. And it's also kind of inspirational to read about his foibles and what he's, you know, all of his drawbacks. This is a guy who's one of the most commercially successful writers in history. And he's been in the trenches. He knows what it takes to get stuff done. And that's related to this question as well, is they're also, you're not going to want to hear this based on what we were just saying about, you know, editing and reading through and making sure that you're going through all of this stuff all of these times. There also has to reach a point where, you know what, I'm done. And that's something that a lot of authors also struggle with. You don't have to have perfection. You have to have something that you're proud of. You have to have something that you think is your voice and is reflective of what you want to say. If you're reading through it for a fourth time and your changes are minor, you're futzing over commas and should this be a semicolon or an em dash, if you're at that point, you're done. And it's important to know when that is.
I actually just read On Writing and I loved it also. And he he reads like 88 books a year or something, and he was talking about that, and then he writes 2,000 words a day. But it was very inspiring. So I second that.
I want to maybe not make the distinction between William Zinsser and Stephen King, but there's also a book called On Writing Well. I don't know if you know that one, but it's also actually surprisingly fun to read. He goes into the weeds on a few different kinds of writing, talks about travel writing, and even I think he has a chapter on sports writing. But the first about 10 short chapters by William Zinsser on writing well. I love the King book, but this is also a really nice one, and specifically on nonfiction. So I think it's also a good book that I recommend. I love this is great because I was going to ask you all for recommendations of books on writing, and I don't know if there's a religious schism on Strunk and White, or is there because I know there's a pro and there's an anti camp here. It sounds like Don, I suspected this might happen. It sounds like Jess is pro and Don is anti. That Strunk and White, The Elements of Style, that's E.B. White, by the way, of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little fame, and the New Yorker. But if anybody has, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this one, because this gets into the sort of editing, writing is editing, and you know what's going on. Does anybody? Should I kick off the Strunk and White a schism here, or any thoughts on that?
I'll let Jess start and then I'll retort.
Wow, fighting words. I think so. I was introduced to Strunk and White when I was but a wee baby editor in baby editor school, and I think it taught me some of the most important lessons on editing and being an editor. It's so not my style normally. Obviously, I'm an eats, shoots, and leaves person. I'm a Stephen King person, and yet one of the most important things I learned from it was that, you know, keep it simple, stupid, right? Like some things are just more simple than you think. Some things you don't need to belabor the point. You don't need to, you know, add all of these flourishes and whatever. If you keep things simple, if you get down to just what the meat and potatoes of writing is, the rest will follow, the art will follow. So that's what I like about Strunk and White. And now my good friend Don is going to tear me apart. And I just want you to know that he's wrong, but we're going to let him speak.
The big issue I have with Strunk and White is that Strunk and White, while there are really good ideas in Strunk and White, it's a product of a different era and a different style of writing, and it can be a little prescriptive. And by that I mean Strunk and White can sometimes say things are right and things are wrong, when that's not really how the world works, that there is a particular way you should be writing. And I think that depending, as I said before, depending on your audience, you really should have some flexibility in how things are worded and what the style you're working in is. So, and since I've spent most of my career editing for not a lay audience, but an audience without a background in a particular subject, it's really important to me that clarity is king. And Strunk and White sometimes are they're a little rigid.
Don, you have a follow-up question to defend your point.
Oh yeah, from Matt.
So how much latitude do you give an author to break the rules? I like that you put break the rules in quotes, because what those rules are can vary dramatically. Even within the universe of what I've been talking about, if I'm reading an ethnography of, you know, some village in Tibet, and the author is trying to give the feel for what it was like to become part of, you know, participant observation within that village and getting to know people, that's going to I'm going to have a lot more colloquialism in something like that than I am in something like Jeremy's book, where you're talking about, okay, here is the history of Central Asia covering X period, and you're talking more documentary stuff. So yeah, it varies depending on what the book is. And as far as breaking the rules go, nonfiction, it's pretty, you can pretty much say a lot of what you want to say without breaking the rules. That really starts to play heavily when you start getting into more fiction and, God forbid, poetry. That is just, that's a different world, and it's not something that I can really speak to.
Thanks, Don. I think I agree. I mean, I think you can do so much. I often have students concerned about the first person, and I said, well, maybe, there is a form of the first person that, yeah, we have to keep out of formal nonfiction, but then if you go to an extreme, you say, one went to the post office or something like that, and you can kind of take it a little bit too far.
That's what Strunk and White wants you to do.
Yeah.
Come on now, you're not giving them latitude, Dawn. I think you need to be a little more forgiving with Strunk and White. After all, this is a historical document. I think we can appreciate as historians what documents from the past, the spirit rather than the letter of those documents, right?
Right, but actually, that does. I mean, you're being facetious, but it really does bring up a good point, which is, I would say Strunk and White is very valuable if you're critical of what you're looking at, and you know to take it in the context of what it is. Then yes, it can be a good document. But taking Strunk and White as scripture, I think, can be very dangerous.
Sure, yeah. And I think that, not to belabor my metaphor too much, but I think that speaks to history in general. Like, we always need to be open to new ideas, to new evidence that emerges that might color the context of past events in a different way. So yeah, read Strunk and White. Don't just toss it aside because it's old and they're supposedly rigid. You can take some valuable lessons away from it.
Missed that in the chat just now, that the alternate title of Eats, Shoots, and Leaves there.
Yeah, I like that.
I do want to recommend the essays of E.B. White, by the way, actually, which are really delightful. If anybody, they're in collected volumes. I'm listening to a volume instead of the bleak news on my commute, by the way, which is really nice. And he breaks all of his rules. He breaks all of Strunk's rules anyway. Were there any other questions that were up here? Oh, I wanted to actually, because we're at the bottom of the hour, and I want to let our guests go when they need to go, and I don't want to keep them much longer than an hour. But I see one from Devin. Any advice on independent magazines? Any advice or experience independent magazines or zines? Devin says he wanted to create his own, combining combining art and essays to hand out at local backyard shows. So that kind of initiative and personal type of project. Any tips or suggestions about that kind of work?
I've never worked in zines myself, but I know Lily will totally agree with me on this, which is that if you feel called to do that and you want to do it. That sounds incredible. I love nothing more than being at, craft fairs and events and whatever, and just having, local artists, writers, poets, musicians be like, hey, listen to my Spotify playlist here, have a sample of my art. Here's my zine. I think that's a great project and a great way to independently sort of learn the ropes of creating that material yourself.
Yeah, I totally agree. You should just go for it, do it. Even if it's bad at first, just get it out there. And I actually have a friend who prints her own zines. Or I don't know if it's zines, but she does book pressing. I forget what it's called exactly, but she has her own whole system. So that's something you could look into if that's what you're interested in. But yeah, go for it. Other than that, though, I don't really have any expertise in it.
I like that also in terms of the NaNoWriMo sort of thing, getting words on the page, getting your material in other people's hands. That's something that you have to break down. That for students, that's something I would say is a sort of stressor that you have to completely eliminate. Get it into your siblings' hands, you know, force it into your friends or your roommates' hands and say, does this make sense? You know, I'll go buy a beer if you read this for me. You know, whatever it takes to get your work read by other people. I have done, no, I made a pot of soup for my 3 housemates once to have them read a paper of mine. So, I mean, you know, whatever you have to do, I think breaking that down, getting your work read by other people, instead of being too protective of it, it has to go out there and get broken and put back together. And that's, I think that's part of what happens. We get used to having that sort of seal broken and just being out there once we're already in the field, and sometimes forget that students have to be really, really bold. You have to get your work out there. Devin, I think that sounds awesome, and I'm looking forward to it. Getting it out there, getting your work out.
Yeah,
That's the big difference, right, between people who do and don't, right? Sorry, Lily.
sorry. No, it just made me think of a book. It's called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. And I think it's very related to the zines, but to anyone who wants to do anything creative, it just kind of helps you unlearn a lot of societal myths that, you know, only certain people are artists, and kind of, if you've ever wanted to create any kind of art, any kind of writing, any kind of zines, anything, it really just helps you get over this hurdle and this kind of self-doubt that you're not really an artist or that you're not good enough. And I think the overarching message of the book is that if you're gonna ever become a good artist or a good writer, you have to first be a bad writer. So you have to just write, and you just have to do it. And then you'll look back and be like, oh, wow, that was bad, but you'll become better. So if you're just, you know, afraid to be bad at something, you're never actually going to become great at it.
I like that. And it goes for Don's beloved poetry and you know, any and nonfiction, you know, whatever it is, you have to get your work out. You have to get your work out there. You have to get your work on the page. Other questions? Has anybody been reluctant to share a question? Jump in. Please jump into the conversation. Raise your hand or type in the chat. And then in just a couple minutes, I do want to let our guests go because it's been a little bit more than an hour. And I think some of you guys are logging in from different time zones where it's an unusual sort of mid-dinner time. Did anybody else want to jump in? This is the last call for questions. Throw them in the chat or raise your hand. All right. Oh, thanks from Daniela. This is really been a lot of fun, and a wide-ranging conversation. Lots of nice recommendations in the chat. Please click through those links for those who have joined. You can find that there. I'll also save the tabs that I have open here on the browser and share it with everybody when I send out the recording to our seminar. But a huge thank you to Jess and Lily and Don for making this happen, for joining us, for sharing your experience and your expertise and your wisdom. This has really been a lot of fun. Thank you.
It's fun for us too. And I wanted to say, sorry, Don. I wanted to say, you know, we talked about networking and stuff. We're all in a network now. So, you know, follow up with us, even if it's just to say like, hi, it was nice to meet you. Follow up, keep in touch a couple years down the line. If you're like, hey, I was in Jeremy's class and I saw you speak and I just had this specific question, like, we'll get back to you now. We're connected, we're pals.
Yep, I can't emphasize that enough. You know, Jeremy, at least in my case, he has my email address. Feel free to share that if anybody wants it. I'm more than happy to answer any kind of specific questions that come up.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Jess. Thank you, Lily. I will, I'll certainly share obviously this recording and also everybody's public facing information that's easy to find if anybody's interested. But a huge thank you. Need to try 15 minutes a day, Rosandra said. Yes, absolutely. It's that habit. Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to shut down this Zoom session. For those who are in the seminar, we'll open it right back up. But a huge thank you to our guests. Thank you, everybody.
Night.
Good night.
Thanks. Good night.